Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. There's a version of gifted education that exists mostly in headlines and stereotypes. It's the version where gifted students are effortlessly successful, naturally motivated, emotionally mature, and destined to thrive simply because they are smart. But anyone who has worked closely with gifted, talented, and highly motivated students for any meaningful amount of time knows that story is incomplete. Because many gifted students are not just learning algebra, chemistry, coding, writing, music, robotics, debate, or research methods. They're also learning something far more subtle. They're learning how to manage the expectations, perceptions, and reactions of the world around them. And over time, many become exceptionally good at it. Last year on this podcast, I used the phrase that gifted students are often masters of masking. And since then, I've continued thinking about that idea because the more I sit with it, the more I believe it explains a tremendous amount about both high-achieving students and the adults many of them eventually become. Now, when people hear the word masking, they often immediately assume something negative. They picture repression, emotional suppression, or some kind of psychological damage. And certainly, masking can become unhealthy. But I think the reality is much more complicated than that. In many ways, masking begins as adaptation. Gifted students tend to become highly observant very early in life. They notice quickly what gets rewarded and what creates friction. They learn when their enthusiasm is welcomed and when it feels socially isolating. They learn when asking too many questions makes them stand out. They learn when achievement earns praise and when it provokes resentment. They learn how adults respond to confidence, intensity, perfectionism, sensitivity, anxiety, boredom, or ambition. And so they adapt. Some learn to downplay their intelligence socially. Others become performers, mastering the ability to look composed even when overwhelmed internally. Some become chronic overachievers because productivity feels safer than vulnerability. Others learn to appear disengaged so they won't stand out too much among their peers. Some become experts at procrastination because they've unconsciously tied their identity to succeeding without visible effort. And in many cases, these adaptations work remarkably well. That's part of what makes this conversation so interesting. The masking itself is often rewarded. Schools tend to reward students who appear mature, organized, resilient, calm under pressure, and academically capable. Families often celebrate children who seem self-sufficient. Colleges reward polished achievement. Society rewards competence. And gifted students are often extraordinarily competent. But competence can sometimes hide cost. One of the most provocative ideas I've wrestled with over the years is this. Schools often mistake gifted students' ability to survive for evidence that they are thriving. Highly capable students can compensate for a tremendous amount. They can compensate for poor instruction, sleep deprivation, anxiety, executive functioning struggles, social isolation, and unhealthy pressure for surprisingly long periods of time. Their cognitive ability often allows them to continue producing acceptable outcomes long after less capable students would visibly struggle, which means adults often miss the warning signs. The compliant perfectionist who quietly internalizes stress may receive far less attention than the student whose distress becomes disruptive. The high-achieving student carrying enormous anxiety may still look successful on paper. The student who is exhausted, emotionally flat, and disconnected from learning may still be earning straight A's and collecting accolades. And because the outcomes still look impressive, adults assume everything is fine. This is part of why the so-called former gifted kid trope on social media resonates so deeply with people. I mean, you've probably seen versions of it before. Adults joking that they were labeled gifted as children and are now anxious, burned out, perfectionistic, avoidant, or terrified of failure. Well, there's humor in those posts, but there's also truth. Many gifted students grow up in systems where being smart becomes part of their identity before they fully developed resilience, emotional regulation, executive functioning, or healthy relationships with effort and failure. They learn to perform giftedness. They learn how to maintain the image of capability. And eventually, for some, that coping system stops working. But I also think we need to be careful not to overcorrect and turn this into a narrative where every form of adaptation is unhealthy because, well, that's not true either. Some masking is probably necessary for adulthood. Every profession requires some level of emotional regulation and adaptation. Educators do it, physicians do it, leaders do it, parents do it. We all learn that there are moments when we must function despite stress, uncertainty, frustration, or fatigue. Part of maturity is learning how to navigate environments that are not perfectly designed around our individual needs. In fact, many gifted adults become highly effective precisely because they learned early how to adapt, persist, observe, and perform under pressure. The real issue is not whether gifted students learn composure or discipline. The issue is whether the mask eventually becomes the entire identity. That's the danger. When students begin believing that their value depends entirely on competence, when asking for help feels like failure, when productivity becomes indistinguishable from self-worth, when curiosity disappears underneath constant performance, when they no longer know how to exist outside of achievement. That's when adaptation begins turning into something more corrosive. And I think this has implications for schools, parents, and educators alike. The purpose of gifted education cannot simply be acceleration and achievement. It cannot only be about getting students into selective colleges, maximizing AP scores, winning competitions, or accumulating accomplishments. Those things do matter, but they're incomplete. Real talent development should also help students build the capacities that schools sometimes accidentally allow gifted students to bypass. Learning how to struggle productively, how to tolerate uncertainty, how to fail without identity collapse, how to collaborate, how to ask for help, how to rest, how to explore, and how to remain connected to genuine curiosity. Because the goal is not simply producing impressive students, the goal is helping young people become healthy, capable, interesting, resilient adults. And perhaps that's the final tension within this conversation. Many gifted students are remarkably adaptive. That adaptation is often a strength that helps them survive environments that may not fully understand them. It helps them achieve at high levels. It helps them navigate complexity and pressure. But over time, students also need spaces where they do not have to constantly manage perception, maintain performance, or protect identity. Spaces where they can be unfinished. Spaces where they can struggle openly. Spaces where they can risk being ordinary for a moment while growing into something larger later. Because maybe the healthiest version of giftedness is not effortless excellence at all. Maybe it's the ability to remain fully human while still pursuing extraordinary potential.
A Slice with Dice is a production of Alderdice. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.